Hi everybody, welcome to your video notes on emotion theory. Today we're going to be trying to tackle three different theories of emotion, two more historic and one a little bit more modern. This is the content from Module 41 that most people need a little more support with. So I wish I could be doing this with you in person, but by going through these notes today, it'll help you get set up to do your emotion theory poster project, which you could work at home from your jammies. How fun would that be? Markers, coloring, cocoa. It sounds amazing. But as we start taking a look at emotion, the first thing that I'm going to have to relieve is some misconceptions that a lot of people have regarding how emotion works. So, your textbook in Module 41 presented three different theories of emotion, but it also took pains to point out that most of us have this common sense notion of how emotions work. That's not really how psychologists or emotion theorists conceive of it. Most of us think that what happens when you feel an emotion is that there is some stimulus, some sort of external cue or thing in the environment that happens that creates an emotion that then evokes some sort of physical response in the body. And while these things are all included as elements in modern theories of emotion, they don't often go in that order. So, for example, your first inclination when I asked you to explain why a person might feel elated, you might give me an example like this. You might say, like, well, I got the message that there was going to be a snow day and school is canceled, right? So it feels like then, after getting that, you feel elated, and that elation triggers some sort of like response in the body. So you start to smile, maybe your heart rate increases, you jump around throwing your fists in the air. Like, maybe that's what your house looked like when you got all those cancellation notices this week. But unfortunately, like, none of our theories of emotion seem to suggest that there's a pattern that happens. All of them do include some sort of link between stimulus and emotion and physical responses that seem to go with them, but not in that order. So if you had written this stuff down, like I had, it's a really bad, like, crossing out of this thing across the screen so that you recognize that's actually not what any of these theories of emotion implies going on. So even though that's where you may have started, that's not exactly what any of these theories are going to tell us. So as we look at our three main theories of emotion, which you're going to be comparing in an emotion theory poster project for me, our first one, and one of our older models, is the James Lange theory of emotion. Credit here is shared by William James and a Dutch researcher named Carl Lange. And just for bonus, like, I haven't shown this to you yet, but holy cow, this is a legit picture of William James as he was a younger guy, spending some time in Brazil. Whoa, that is a very different look than older Civil War era William James. Yeah, look at those specs. That's amazing. Okay, that doesn't really have much to do with the theory, but it's definitely worth looking at. So, this theory actually turns on its head some of the common sense notions that we were talking about at the previous slide. This theory implies that what happens when we experience emotion is this. There's some stimulus, some sort of external thing that happens, maybe that's snow day cancellation stuff. That stimulus itself causes the physiological arousal. So changes in the body, like smiling, heart rate increases, and so forth. And it's those physical changes that give rise to the emotion. So James Lange theory suggests that our emotion is just us becoming aware of and recognizing what our bodies are doing in response to stimuli. And there is some evidence that seems to align with this way of viewing emotions. For example, your textbook describes the fact that when people suffer paralyses of various types due to accidents, those people who lose the sense of feeling in areas below the neck. So people who are unable to feel the muscles of their chest, for example, anymore following their injury, they often will report a very diminished experience of anger, because anger often does involve like tightening of the muscles of the chest, and maybe if you can't feel that, you can't feel anger as intensely, suggesting, of course, that maybe the physical stuff does in part give rise to the emotions that we experience. Your textbook also in a later module um, describes a phenomenon known as facial feedback. Now, the research on this has been in question as of late because this effect has been failing to replicate a little bit. But facial feedback suggests that when we adopt a particular facial expression, which you could try right now if you wanted to. You could paste a smile on your face and see what happens. The idea of facial feedback is that by adopting that facial expression, we actually start to feel emotional experiences more in line with that emotion. So if we were in class, we'd actually be doing a demo that tests this out, because my students like to try this out. But it's a replication of some research that's actually been conducted on facial feedback, where you have people hold things in their mouths at different positions, like a pen. Holding a pen in your teeth forces you into a smile. Whereas if you hold it in the space between your upper lip and your nose, which is challenging, it kind of forces you into a frown or a grimace. And if you give people things to look at, other stimuli you present to them while they're adopting those facial expressions, some of the initial research on this suggested what condition they were assigned to would affect how funny they rated a bunch of cartoons. So people who were forced to smile when looking at those cartoons rated them as funnier than the people who were forced into a frown. Again, there's some controversy about this concept. Its current standing. But the idea of facial feedback does seem kind of consistent with this James Longa theory. The idea that maybe it's our bodies that do the signaling of what the emotion actually is, and that comes first, and that those two things are causally related, that your body actually causes a certain emotional experience. So when your physical self does something that evokes a particular emotional experience. One noted problem with the James Longa theory of emotion that we're going to run into, and that one of our more modern theories attempts to better address, is the fact that some emotions do seem to have really similar underlying physiology. So, for example, if you're angry, your heart starts racing, but your heart also starts racing if you're really afraid, like if you're riding a roller coaster. So, how is it that your body can take two emotions that have kind of similar physiological activity, if the physical arousal is the cause, and then we decide in one case it's one emotion, but in another case that same physiological activity is a different emotion? This theory does not handle that issue very well. This second of our major theories doesn't really handle it much better, I would argue, but it's another historic model of emotion, so one that emerged early in the history of researching this topic, and one that sometimes you'll hear people kind of endorse. It's been replaced, just like the James Longa theory, with a more modern version. But Walter Cannon and Philip Bard were both physiologists, and they were studying all kinds of things related to physiological psychology. And they actually suspected that emotions can't work in the way that the James Longa theory implied, in part because the belief was that if information about a stimulus becomes available to somebody, that it might become simultaneously available to cause the physiological reaction and for you to consciously recognize a feeling, that there couldn't be a separation in time between those things. So this theory suggests that a stimulus is present, like maybe that notification of the snow day, and simultaneously you'll feel the physiological arousal. So your heart rate will increase, you'll start smiling, throwing your fists in the air, and at the same time you would feel elated. The notion here is that these things happen simultaneously, but are not causally connected. They're separate processes. So there is, again, some evidence for that. Cannon and Bard pointed to some research that they have been doing with dogs, which this may be, my apologies in advance, because this is pretty mean to the dogs. Yeah, oh, and interestingly, these guys, Walter Cannon specifically, was the person that identified the fight or flight response system and the physiology that creates it. So he's definitely uncovered some important things for us. But one of the things that he did in pursuit of the evidence for this theory was he did surgeries where he disconnected some of the nerve endings, like the sensory neurons that would carry messages from a dog's viscera or guts to their central nervous system, so that while those organs were still functioning, the animals wouldn't be able to feel their activity. So like if a dog was frightened, presented with some sort of frightening stimulus, they would experience a heart rate increase and changes in digestion that normally accompany a fight or flight response. but the dogs wouldn't be able to physically feel those things happening within their bodies. And when it turns out when you do that, the dog still will give you what appears to be a fear response. So this was, in his mind, evidence that, it's not the physiology that's causing it. The physiology may be there, like the physical arousal happens at the same time in response to the stimulus, but it doesn't prevent, its absence, or the absence of the feeling of that doesn't prevent the emotion from happening. So he just thought these were simultaneously arising processes. Now, Cannon-Bard theory actually doesn't account for some of the research that was done by a couple more modern researchers who put forth their own theory of emotion, which now carries much more weight in the emotion research. And it actually accounts for stuff that some of the earlier theories couldn't. So this is a theory that's sometimes known as two-factor theory because it does suggest that emotions have two parts. And sometimes it's known as the Schachter-Singer theory because Stanley Schachter is the principal researcher behind this. He did some experiments with Peter Singer, which I'm going to describe for you. So it goes by a bunch of different names, but it's the same idea regardless. Emotions have two parts to them. The physiological arousal, or the physical arousal, is part of it. So when you encounter a stimulus like that unexpected snow day, it maybe does cause some of those heart rate increases and the smiling, but that you have to interpret that in a cognitive way. You have to think about what those things mean. And once you've made a decision about what those things mean, that's what creates the emotional experience. This does seem to well explain why two people might encounter the same event and even same physiological activity arising from the event, but walk away from it with different emotional experiences. For example, a stressor and people's different responses to stressors seem to be well explained by this. Like if you've got an upcoming test that might cause the awareness of that might cause your muscles to tense a little bit, your blood pressure to increase, but you can interpret that in different ways. Some people will feel, well, I've got an upcoming test, this is a challenge. So they label their physiological arousal as excitement or anticipation. Other people might make a different interpretation. They might interpret these feelings that are happening in the body as a sign of being overwhelmed and incapacitated. So then, of course, they're going to have an emotional experience of being overwhelmed or incapable of responding, which is much more negative. So this theory has been super fruitful because it's actually informed how we might help people interpret some of the physical feelings that they're having in a more positive way. In fact, a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy attempts to do just that, to help people recognize internal body things and maybe relabel them in a way that doesn't give rise to as many negative emotions. And of course, there are several different examples of research that seem to support this way of thinking. One, your textbook describes as the spillover effect. This is when you're experiencing intense physiological arousal because of a particular event or stimulus, and then the physical arousal kind of spills over into a different emotional experience, which you then interpret differently. So if you're going on a run and you got your heart rate jacked up, maybe that heart rate increase while you're running you interpret as, just signs of physical activity and nothing to be alarmed about. But then you get home and receive like an upsetting phone call. Well, you might be, because of the running, your heart rate is increased substantially. Now that increased heart rate you don't interpret as a sign of running, but as a sign of your intense anger, and you feel the anger much more intensely. That's a spillover effect. Probably the most famous research in support of the two-factor theory, though, is an experiment that Schachter and Singer conducted together, where they gave participants injections of epinephrine or adrenaline, which, as you might remember, is going to increase their heart rate and breathing and cause a sympathetic nervous system response. And some of the participants were informed that they were given epinephrine. Others were kept blind to this. For those that were kept blind to it, and to the controls, they were sent to a waiting room while the effects set in. And there were Confederates there that acted in different ways, either really happy and elated or very angry. And it turns out the participants kind of adopted the emotional expressions or the emotional experience of the people around them. If they didn't know what they were given, if they didn't know that it was epinephrine, and their heart was racing and they felt all agitated, they would rely on people around them and the cues to help them interpret what that is. Is it happiness? Or is it anger? Controls who knew what the epinephrine was were not vulnerable to this. They were able to say, like, oh, well, why is my heart racing? Because of the epinephrine. So this was a sign that the cognitive labeling of the physical response may actually matter.